Okay, so this is part two of the PowerPoint we started going over in class the other day. So Edward Said, I've been banging on about for half the year. As you know, he was a very influential writer on colonialism. Um, he was a scholar in the humanities. The interesting thing about Edward Said in terms of how he connects with Megan Stack is that he grew up in Egypt and Palestine, but his entire education was Western. Now, you could argue that despite the fact that Megan Stack grew up in the US, a great deal of her sort of worldview was created, consolidated, confirmed, or contradicted in the Middle East. So there's an interesting sort of counter or an interesting connection you can make between Stack and Edward Said on that level. That sort of cross-cultural connection is interesting, I think, and worth remarking on if you write about Edward Said. Okay, he's written over 20 books. Orientalism is the one we've touched on the most. Some of the other titles are the culture and imperialism, blaming the victims, and the politics of dispossession. So all of those texts are focused on a process of what he called othering, but I'll come to that in a moment. He died fairly recently at the age of 67, and it would be very interesting to hear what he has to say about the conflict in Syria in particular now. I think it's a shame he's not still around. Okay, the coloniser and the colonised frames, or the power struggles between the coloniser and the colonised, frames a lot of Edward Said's writings. Now, this quote here up the top, which I have referred to quite a lot throughout the Encountering Conflict course, this quote gives you lots of opportunity to frame your discussion. So, to Said, the colonised people are something one judges as in a court of law, something one studies and depicts as in curriculum, something one disciplines as in a school or prison, something one illustrates as in a zoological manual. Now, you could, if you wanted to, use Said as a thread and break up this quote. It would be interesting, I think, to have the whole quote as perhaps part of your first paragraph, and then from there break it down. So, something one judges and consider the way the West has judged the other throughout history. Consider specific examples of that. Something one studies. So obviously Stack has studied the other to a certain extent in her text. Something one depicts. So again, how has the media throughout history or throughout recent history depicted the other? So how has history depicted Muslim people? How has history depicted Aboriginal people? How has media depicted anyone who does not fit the sort of dominant cultural norm, if you like? And something one disciplines. So how have people who are not part of that mainstream culture been punished because of their cultural difference? And there are lots of examples throughout that. So you need to think about your material and how it could connect with these things. And finally, something one illustrates as in the zoological manual. Now, certainly we've had a lot of discussion about different artistic representations of conflict, and that's something that you could use here. This idea of a zoological manual, though, really is, conducive to the notion that the other is the savage, if you like, or some sort of animalistic, evil brute. And certainly when we think about My Lai, the actions of those who invaded Vietnam and slaughtered hundreds of Vietnamese people could be seen as the savage, whereas they really were of the mindset that the people that they were killing were the savages. So just an interesting quote that you could use as a framework for discussion. A great revision technique right now might be to stop and think about this quote and have a look at your material and see how the two, the quote and your material, intersect. Look at these verbs and think about the material you are looking at and how your examples, so how your journalists that you're looking at, your theorists that you're looking at, your moments in history intersect with this quotation. How could you use this quotation as a framework for discussion? In fact, stopping right now and making a note of this quote and looking at all of your material and thinking about how they intersect would be an excellent revision task. So I suggest you pause the screencast and do that now. Moving on though, consolidating this quotation I think is a sort of more simplified version. The point is that in each of these cases the Oriental is contained and represented by dominating frameworks. Now remember that the Oriental is used by Said to sum up at the time those in the Middle East, but it can also be used to talk about Asia as we know it. So China, Japan, Thailand, Vietnam, all of those parts of the world that we have had a tendency to stereotype depending on individuals' culture or the culture that they belong to. So the fact that the Oriental is contained and represented by dominating frameworks, again, the dominating framework being the West. So the dominating framework is the framework that's decided on as valid by the West. So the dominant culture, i.e. white people, decides what is, the framework with which we will contain and represent the Oriental. So when we think about containment and representation, that really summarises what's going on up here. So again, some great words that you can use and a couple of really sort of solid quotations that you can use as a basis for discussion. Said's cultural analysis can also be used to frame the experience of Indigenous Australians as examples of the other in a colonial context. So we've discussed that at length, and I still think that this is a really valid road to take your essays down. Okay, colonialism. So this is the idea of Europe as a mother nation. So one of the key tenets of colonialism is a sort of patronising idea that the West acts as a kind of parent to those beneath it. So the notion of Europe as a mother nation has a sort of patronising air about it, because by virtue of the fact that if Europe is the mother nation, clearly whoever falls under the mother is the child. So this has a really infantilizing quality about it. Colonialism as a theory looks at the way that the other is infantilized or made sort of juvenile by dominating frameworks. Colonialism stems from the imperialist expansion of Europe and the rest of the world. So this imperialist expansion is about the forceful sort of occupation of other territories, usually in terms of, why is that doing that? Okay, yeah, so usually, when I say by force, like I'm talking about, guns and war and armaments, so people moving in on other people's land with the threat to kill. So colonialism refers to the dominance, control and influence of Europe and more broadly the West over Indigenous peoples. And it denotes a system that carries with it inherent notions of racial inferiority and exotic otherness. That sort of sums it up. So assumptions about those that are the child to Europe that are evocative of inferiority and something kind of exotic and strange, if you like. Imperialism is a policy of extending a country's power by process of colonisation through military force. So I've sort of already touched on that. Colonisation is the process by which. So colonialism is this sort of idea of the other. Colonisation is different. It's the process by which one country invades and takes over another country or territory. And this is sort of a map. This says present. I'm not exactly sure if how close to 2015 this map is. You would need to look into that, but certainly it's a useful depiction of the colonisation of Israel and the occupation of that land. Okay, so when you use the other, it's useful to use it with the quotation marks, just to acknowledge that when you're using that term, you're citing Said. So the term the other refers to the social and psychological ways in which one group excludes or marginalises another group. This is key as well. When you look at your prompts for conflict, don't just think about actions. Think about the cultural and psychological or social and psychological manipulation. Think about the things that are inherent in culture. And I keep talking about this sort of cultural studies approach, and that is because I believe that it will empower you to discuss lots and lots of different prompts. If you simply look at physical actions, you're going to be very limited in terms of layers of discussion, but certainly if you're thinking about the cultural phenomenon or the cultural process of othering, you can discuss social and psychological ways in which one group excludes or marginalises another group. It's going to give you more layers of discussion. So by declaring someone as other, the emphasis is on what that person is not. So this is about what a lack. If you look at the other, you are actually looking at that person as lacking what you have. Okay, so what we do from an Orientalist perspective, as part of a dominant Western culture, is look at anyone who doesn't belong to that culture and we look at them and consider them as less than or lacking what we are or have. So we're looking at them and thinking about how they're dissimilar to us, how they're not the same as us. And we assume that because they're not the same as us, that they are inferior. So this is inherent in cultural assumptions about the other. We decide straight away that this person is less than us based on their culture or where they're from. And this carries over obviously into the way the other is represented and can be a catalyst for stereotypes. So if we go back to that quote from Said, how the other is depicted or illustrated is key to our understanding. So it's a self-fulfilling sort of cycle of judgment and representation that feeds into itself and is ongoing. And the idea of stereotypes certainly can be true, but stereotypes is one single story, and what we need to understand is that there are multiple stories. Said would argue that if we understood multiple stories within one culture, then this process of othering wouldn't occur. But as it is, the West understands a single story. Really important to acknowledge that idea of the single story, I think, if you're talking about conflict between the West and the other. Okay, Orientalism is the process by which the Orient has been constructed by European studies and culture over the last 300 or so years. It's a broad Western generalisation rather than a true study, and helps to perpetuate the stereotypes that I mentioned before. And Orientalism, and this is really important, I hope you pick up some of the key verbs that are used in this PowerPoint, because if you adopt key verbs and you understand their meaning, it will bring precision to your writing and the way you frame your discussion. The idea that Orientalism erodes and ignores substantial difference among the people and puts an umbrella over those people. So, there's this decision that, okay, all of these people are one thing, And this idea that they are all one thing means the notion of substantial difference or individuality disappears and is ignored. It doesn't exist. All African people are, insert adjective here. All Muslim people are, insert adjective here. It's this idea that there could not be shades of difference within a culture. This YouTube clip is very useful in sort of illustrating that point, I would argue. Sorry, I'm just going to... Okay, so I am going to play this clip now, and I want you to consider the ways in which Orientalism plays to a common stereotype and what that means in terms of history. We watched this in class, so if you just want to remember what it was and make some notes on it, then that would be useful to you at this point. You don't have to watch the whole thing. Certainly, it's a demonstration of Orientalism within the media at work.
And according to a U.S. government source told CBS News that it has Middle East terrorism written all over it.
The attack in Oklahoma City appears to have a familiar mark.
This was done with the attempt to inflict as many casualties as possible. That is a Middle Eastern trait.
The fact that it was such a powerful bomb in Oklahoma City immediately drew investigators to consider deadly parallels that all have roots in the Middle East.
ABC News has learned that the FBI has asked the U.S. military to provide up to 10 Arabic speakers to help in the investigation.
Orientalism tries to answer the question of why, when we think of the Middle East, for example, we have a preconceived notion of what kind of people live there, what they believe, how they act, even though we may never have been there or indeed even met anyone from there. More generally, Orientalism asks, how do we come to understand people, strangers, who look different to us by virtue of the color of their skin? The central argument of Orientalism is that the way we acquire this knowledge is not innocent or objective, but the end result of a process that reflects certain interests. That is, it is highly...
The idea that Orientalism is a notion that protects or reflects certain interests is key to understanding how this feeds into conflict, okay? So the dominant frameworks or the dominant culture or the people in power have particular interests that they want to uphold, maintain, support or reap the rewards from, and those things, Orientalism is a really convenient sort of way of achieving those goals. For example, the Australian government, by othering the Indigenous people as child abusers and all of those things that are covered in Utopia when we looked at it, by doing that, it provides a convenient tool for the government to then, occupy particular pockets of land that might be mineral rich, for example, as implied by John Pilger. Again, Western Australian remote communities, pushing those remote communities off their land, which has been going on this year, that the Orientalist idea that these people are living as savages is a really comfortable position for the government to hold if they want to use the land that those Indigenous people are living on. So keep that in mind. Orientalism as a tool for, accessing the things that powerful people want to access. I'm not going to show you the whole video because you can watch this if you want to, but it also has it has Edward Said speaking. So again, go to YouTube, find the video or the links on my Padlet wall so you can use it there. Okay. So back to this. This is just the definition of the Orient to Said. I'm not going to talk through this. You could pause the video here and make some notes. The word ideology is key in your discussion of Orientalism, and certainly the ideology of a government will determine their sort of Orientalist values, or the values that they subscribe to, and just how, I guess, racist those values might be will determine what sort of policies and decisions are being made. So a system of values, beliefs or ideas shared by some social groups taken for granted as natural or inherently true. So this idea of goodies and baddies is an ideology adopted recently by the Australian government that has fed into Orientalist assumptions. Okay, as I've said, a discussion of cultural values is central to our exploration of every man in this village is a liar. I'm going to pose a couple of questions here. What I want you to do is actually think about them and answer them. So pause the video and do some writing just off the top of your head. Think about these things. Think about what ideas emerge for you, and make some notes. Perhaps you might come up with some gold that you'll be able to use in the exam. So the first question is, by what process are our values as individuals acquired? So how do we decide, or how is our ideology formed? So think about the things that are put in place from a young age. What happens to us that we end up deciding particular things about particular people? The second question is, who has a say in the things we hold dear as individuals? Third question, is there such a thing as goodies and baddies? And if so, who decides who is who? Think about Tony Abbott, and if you go online, you'll be able to find some of the kind of quite, I see them as quite extreme, this sort of extreme polarisation of peoples when he says goodies and baddies, and he frames Muslims as baddies and baddies. You need to, I would suggest to answer this question, you need to Google Tony Abbott, baddies and baddies, and see what comes up and come up with an answer. Why does the West feel the need to get involved in wars that are removed from it both geographically and philosophically? Now, I would pick up Megan Stack's text here and have a look at the sort of opening chapters and see what she comes up with, because some pretty interesting ideas. But again, the notion that Orientalism comes from a place where people in positions of power are going to benefit from cultural assumptions. Think about that and come up with an answer of your own to that question. Okay, so this was the email that I sent you earlier in the year. An article on Orientalism and this YouTube clip. Pardon me. It's Edward Said on Orientalism, and if you want to watch another, I think 20 minutes of Said talking about his theories, and this is a really great one if you still don't really understand it. But again, I see Orientalism as a great thread, whether or not you're talking about journalism, or whether or not you're talking about truth or fear or injustice or whatever it is that the topic might be. Certainly as a byproduct of conflict and as something that contributes to conflict, it's certainly worth using this in your essay. I hope that helped.